Thanks for having me today. I'm going to be talking about grant writing fundamentals. This is going to be a little bit different than the grants that Amanda was talking about, which were related to COVID relief. Just a little bit about myself to start. My name is Laura O'Grady. I am the owner of O'Grady Partnerships, LLC. So I do some freelance grant writing, research, and boilerplate content development. Boilerplate content just means the type of text that you can use in multiple grants. It's the very typical questions that you might get asked a lot, and you can kind of just tweak and modify for different grants. My professional background is I'm currently the Vice President of Advancement for York Day Nursery, and I'm formerly the Director of the Hershey Public Library. And before that, I was the Director of Development for York County Libraries. So my background is in nonprofit fundraising and management. So we're going to be talking about grants today, grant writing specifically, because a lot of nonprofit organizations feel really. Are you guys seeing my slides advance? I just want to make sure. Okay, you're seeing that. Okay, great, good. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to be talking about the foundation fundamentals about how to work with foundations that do grant making, finding grants, what grants support, the common grant components that you'll get asked, things to consider before you commit to grant writing, and we'll definitely have time for questions. The reason we're starting with foundation fundamentals is because a significant portion of grant funds are distributed through private foundations. So it's really helpful to understand what they are and how they operate. And just to put this in perspective, in 2019, Americans gave $449 billion to charity, and 17% of that giving was done by foundations. And that number comes out to about $75 billion. Giving by foundations grew 2.5% in 2019 and has grown in 9 of the last 10 years. I used this statistic because this was a snapshot before COVID, so you could see the trajectory that things were going. And people were very curious about how COVID would change giving levels, but actually it has continued to increase. Foundations continue to distribute what they're expected to distribute, if not even a little bit more. And the only thing that's really changed with COVID and foundation giving is that they are more receptive to applications for operating support. So we'll get into that a little bit. In addition to this figure that I'm showing you here, there are over 86,000 grant-making foundations in the United States, and they have $867 billion in total assets. So the thing to remember is that this money is intended to be given away. So there's $867 billion in assets, and that doesn't mean it's all be given away. That just means that's the total value. But you can see here that $75 billion of that was given away in 2019. So if you are a nonprofit leader, it's really important to consider foundation grant writing as a big part of your fundraising strategy. So what even is a foundation? A lot of people assume that you understand what that means because the word is thrown around a lot. So I just want to start us off right there. A foundation is an independent legal entity that is set up entirely for charitable purposes. The funding for a foundation typically comes from a single individual, family, or corporation. And right here, I have some logos of different types of foundations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, everyone knows them. They were set up by Bill and Melinda Gates and their family. The Rite Aid Foundation is an example of a corporate foundation. And then the Knight Foundation was a result of a media conglomerate, the Knight family, and they do grant making primarily for media and journalism activities. And it is important to note that foundations receive tax deductions for their donations. But it is confusing about how we use the word foundation. So a private foundation is a 501c3 organization, and they do not rely on public fundraising to continue their activities. As I mentioned, their funding typically comes from a single individual, family, or corporation, and they have a required yearly spend. This is really important for you to know. They're about 5%, typically between 3 and 7%, depending on the organization, of their 3-year rolling average of their assets. is a required yearly spend. So they need to give this money away. It is part of their mission. An example of a private foundation, as I said, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The other side of the coin is a public charity, but the word foundation can often be used for a public charity too, and it's confusing. An example is the Make-A-Wish Foundation. They are also a 501c3, but they do rely on public fundraising to continue their activities. Typically, they do not make grants, but they rather focus on service delivery. They might offer a few small program grants, but that is not their main purpose. Now, since private foundations, which you'll see in the left column here, since they stay under the control of the donor or founder, they determine their mission, their board members, where their funds are invested, and how and where their funds are given away. So that freedom to choose illustrates why relationship building is a really key ingredient to receiving support from foundations. Often nonprofits think that the receiving grant funds is really just about writing a good application and sitting behind a computer. But a big part of that is the relationship that you're able to establish with the foundation before you ever submit a grant application. So there's also community foundations. This is also kind of confusing because they are technically a public charity. But they support a certain geographic area by facilitating and pooling donations to address big community needs. An example is the York County Community Foundation. Many different programs fulfill the mission of community foundations. They have donor-advised funds, endowments, scholarships, and giving circles. A giving circle is just kind of like a smaller version of a community foundation. So grant-making efforts of community foundations are supported by both donations to the foundation and investment income. So they're investing their donations that they are received, and then the results of those investments are what allows you to make grants. The grant making typically falls into one of the following categories. There's designated funds, there's field of interest funds, there's scholarship funds, and unrestricted funds. Designated funds are used to support one or more designated charities, so we directed to a certain charity. There's a field of interest fund that's used for a particular issue like education or healthcare. Scholarship funds are for education, as you could imagine. Unrestricted funds are used to meet a community's unexpected needs, like a natural disaster, or most recently in our case, like COVID. So a lot of community foundations tapped into their unrestricted funds and said, how can we help immediately right now? Then there's government grants. And this kind of talks about what Amanda was presenting about earlier. Government grants, if you're thinking outside of COVID relief, typical government grants, there's big money available. So that's part of the pros. And it can be a potential way to establish a fruitful partnership regarding policy. So if you are you work in a homeless shelter and you get a big government grant because you've got a really innovative program, you could help influence larger legislation. And so that can be a really important avenue to pursue. The cons of government grants are that they have complicated applications, between 80 to 200 hours for some of them. They typically have short lead times, between 4 and 8 weeks, and they have slow reimbursements sometimes. And it's important to remember that it often is a reimbursement grant. So you need to be able to pay the money out ahead of time for whatever you applied for and then get reimbursed for it. So if you're new to grant writing, I highly recommend you pursue foundation grants before you pursue government grants. If you do know of a big government grant that typically comes out yearly for your institution or organization, just keep an eye on it 1 year and maybe attend the webinar, log in and create a profile just so you can see what do they ask of you, so you can kind of prepare for that for in the future when you're able to really pursue it. So how to find grants? There's a few different ways. For private foundations, you really can't beat a resource called the Foundation Center. The Foundation Center is expensive, but some public libraries have access to it that you can use, most likely on site at the library, because it's an expensive database, so they don't allow you to use it outside of the building. But I encourage you to check with your local library. I know Martin Library in downtown York does have it, as well as Dauphin County Library System. While I said it's expensive, it has an extensive directory of private and corporate foundations and a really good learning center. Some other options besides Foundation Center is Grant Watch, Grant Station, and GuideStar. So one thing that I hope you take away from this presentation is GuideStar. GuideStar is a free resource that allows you to search for the 990s of different nonprofit organizations, which means that you have a GuideStar profile as a nonprofit leader, your organization does. And it's up to you to go in and update it. Sometimes grant makers will research your GuideStar profile to see how much transparency you've got in terms of uploading your board members, your leadership, your 990s. And so it's one thing you should do is make sure your GuideStar profile is up to date. But you can also use GuideStar to research the funder. So you can go on and look at the 990 of a foundation and see who they were giving to. So it's a really sneaky and interesting way to research potential funders. For state grants, you should check with the state department that most closely aligns with your mission. For an example, public libraries in Pennsylvania are operated under the Department of Education, so that's where you'd go to seek grant funding. For federal grants, you should just sign up for the grants.gov listserv, and then you get updates for every time a grant becomes available. You should also consider alignment. Just look for that. Oh dear. I'm good. Consider alignment when you are researching grants. You should make sure it's really a good fit. Don't try and fit a square peg program into a round hole funder, because it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of the funder's time to even read your grant application. They'll know. So what types of support are offered through grants? There's operating support or unrestricted funds. And this is becoming more common since going through COVID. This is for day-to-day operating costs to support the general work of an organization. Before COVID, this was it was not very common, but it is becoming more common now. There's capital support for capital campaigns that can involve construction or acquisition, renovations, remodeling, or even major equipment purchases. But the most common type are program grants or restricted funds, which is funding for a particular project. If you want to connect with a foundation, I encourage you to research the annual reports of a foundation that you're interested in, just so you can see where their priorities are and also who they're supporting. Join AFP, which is the Association of Fundraising Professionals. There's a lot of great continuing education that you can get through that. You should draft a letter of inquiry about your project or program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And don't forget to network, network, and network. I know it can be annoying, but every time you talk to someone or meet someone, it is an opportunity to learn about them and to share what your organization is doing. Informal interviews just means like whoever you sit next to at lunch. You never know if they sit on the board of somewhere else and connect you with someone you weren't even considering. Talk with other nonprofit leaders. You should talk with the board members of foundations and talk with your board members, because you don't always have to do all the heavy lifting to connect out in the community. It's possible that your board members might be able to connect with a board member for somewhere else. And your civic organizations like Rotary and Lions and Kiwanis, they're always a really good resource for sharing your message, and there's usually grant funding available there also. So I mentioned the letter of inquiry. This is a really helpful way to just start the process of seeking for grants. It helps you demonstrate your commitment to pursuing funding, because you almost think of it like a white paper for how you develop your concept. It provides an opportunity to organize your thoughts and identify additional information that would be needed for a full application. And it can be used a few different ways. It can be used, as I said, as a working paper to help research and identify grant makers, as a tool to engage your staff, your board members, or your partners, as an actual letter of inquiry for grant makers, or as a full proposal for grant makers who require a minimal application. So a letter of inquiry, you can kind of think about as a working document that continues to get fleshed out as you do more research, as you get more ideas, as you meet with new community members. It's kind of just the nugget of an idea that you help expand. Another acronym you'll see is an RFP. This is a request for proposals. That is an invitation by a grant maker to submit a proposal for funding. It helps grant makers take the initiative in seeking proposals rather than reacting to what comes in. It can also be an effective mechanism for standardizing proposals. So big foundations like the Knight Foundation, they will put out an RFP. They say, okay, we're going to take proposals until this date, rather than them just coming in all the time and not being able to manage them. So it really is a thing for just management purposes on their end. Some common grant materials that you will be asked for are listed here, and I encourage you to gather and polish these documents and keep them in a shared drive that you and whoever is going to be working with you has access to. I also encourage you to update them yearly and get rid of the old version so you don't have duplicates of the same thing like your audit or your board or committee list. So here you can see them, your mission statement, your IRS designation, your organizational history, org chart, your operating budget, your audit, your board and committee list, and the administration and staff list. So store this in an easily accessible place like standard grant documents. And so that way multiple people can have access to it. So these are the common grant components that a grant application will typically ask. It seems like a lot of them it's redundant. You're going to end up saying a lot of the same thing over and over and again, but often when someone is reviewing a grant, it could be a committee. And so when they get all the big grant applications, they kind of chop them up and split them up so everyone can read it together. So it helps to reiterate some of your ideas in a few different places. So we're going to go through these one by one, but don't feel overwhelmed. It's not going to be too boring. So an introduction, it should be concise and capture the attention of the reader. You want to give context to your program, the social context, the economic context, and the environmental context. You want to touch on key points in your organization's history. It actually sometimes helps to write the introduction last because you want to summarize everything that you put in the rest of it. The introductions to foundations will differ when you're applying to a corporate donor. So a corporate donor will want to know how their name will reach a lot of people. So demographics, visit numbers, how their name or logo is going to reach new people, all that's going to help your application. You want to explain what market you will reach for them. The statement of need, this is also an incredibly common part of a grant application. This is where you articulate the problem clearly and develop a compelling opportunity for the grant maker to invest. So why should they care? You want to describe the specific, which is often negative, conditions that you're trying to fix. This is just about the current conditions, not about what you're going to do to fix it. You want to paint a picture. You should establish a clear link between the problem and the grant maker's funding priorities. Use statistics to describe what is, and use expert opinion to describe what should be. The project narrative is another incredibly common part of the grant application. This is a description of the approach you will take to address the issue. You should open by summarizing what you intend to do and then expand to add critical detail. So this is like the old journalism adage, don't bury the lead. Open by summarizing what you're going to do and then add the detail. It's helpful to write this after you develop your goals, your evaluation, your budget, and your timeline, because the narrative will summarize all those parts. The length and the detail of project narrative will vary based on the number of pages allowed, the amount of money being requested, or the information you need to portray the program accurately. Often in grant applications nowadays, it's not the number of pages that they dictate, it's the number of characters in a text field. So I often write my grant applications in a Word document so I can monitor the character count and then just put it into the field when I'm ready to be done. A note on goals and objectives, because they will ask this, they are different. Goals are visionary or your visionary motivation that defines what will occur for the people you serve if the program is successful. So big picture. Objectives are the measurable and achievable outcomes that fall within the scope of proposed work. But then there's also output versus outcomes. Output is the bean counting of your activity or your project. So the number of people who attended your class on personal finance. But the outcome is the measurement of change in your clients or community. So an example is the number of participants who stuck with the budget in the 6 months following your class. In the budget and the budget narrative, which again, they will most definitely ask for, you should develop an imaginary shopping list. You should certainly include ancillary costs in your budget. Ancillary costs can include salaries, consultant fees, office space, postage, travel, insurance, and publicity. Include administrative fees, typically between 10 to 18% of a project budget. Often nonprofits undercut themselves on this, so include their admin fees. It's totally expected. The budget narrative should tell the same story as your proposal, but using numbers. Include items paid for by other sources. This is really helpful because it gives legitimacy to your grant application if someone else is investing in it too. The more detail you include, the fewer questions that will arise in the review process. An executive summary or project abstract. Not every grant application will ask for this, but I wanted to explain it just in case. It can be several lines up to a full page, succinct and complete, just a really mini version of your grant. It's developed by summarizing all the main points of the other sections. Many grant makers have forms for an executive summary, which limit your space and word count. And the goals are to create curiosity for the funder and to establish credibility for your organization. You may also include a cover letter. This is most common for paper grant applications that you send in, just so they have a nice cover to it. If it seems redundant, it is redundant, but the more, as I said, the more you can reiterate the same ideas, the better, because you don't know how the application will be reviewed and by how many people. For your cover letter, you should use letterhead, describe your project in 1 to 2 sentences, include the money being requested, outline the need with 1 to 2 statistics, very briefly touch on your solution, remind funders of any previous contact that you've had with them, and have your top officer or board chair sign the letter. Attachments, they will always ask for attachments, and these are the most common ones. Your IRS designation, a board member list, letters of support, which you should refer to in your narrative. And if you have more than 5 attachments and you're submitting a paper version, include a table of contents. I encourage you to refer to your letters of support in your narrative because, again, if the application gets split up and one person is reading the narrative and someone else has letters of support, it'll help the person reading the narrative to know that there is that letter of support. Other attachments you should consider: board member biographies, resumes of the key staff involved, research tables and graphs, organizational publications such as a newsletter, photographs or architectural drawings, board resolutions supporting your proposals, a list of foundations and corporations that have made previous grants to your organization, and some tips and tricks. Make sure you align with the funder. You want to work with foundations whose mission and values align with yours. So make sure you do some Googling of the history of a foundation. If you work for an organization that has a very firm stance or belief on an issue, and you apply for a funder who has an opposite view of that, it could look bad to your donors, it could look bad to your board. So just be aware of who you're applying to. I encourage you to start local. This helps you build your writing expertise and your credibility, and the relationships are much easier to establish. Make your budget ahead of time. This will help focus your attention on the right grants instead of reworking the budget to fit a grant that's available. Check the requirements ahead of time, just so you don't waste your time if you write a whole grant and at the end you figure out that you don't meet one of the requirements. So if you don't qualify, don't apply. Look at other nonprofits similar to yourself, both locally and internationally, and see who's funding them. And I encourage you to start measuring your impact now. The more data you have on your impact, the the stronger your application will be. So some big questions you should ask yourself or your nonprofit before you start grant writing. Are we able to invest the necessary resources in writing good grant applications? Can we meet the grant conditions? Are the activities we would conduct consistent with our mission and goals? Can this activity continue after the funding ends? Do you have the right staff with the right qualifications to implement the program? And do you have outcomes related to this work, and how healthy are they? What I mean by healthy outcomes is how deep are they? How much context do they give to the effectiveness of the program? As I said, the more data you can have on current impact and outcomes, the stronger your application will be. So some steps to get started: firm up your documentation and save it somewhere easily accessible. Update your GuideStar profile. Identify a project you want to get funding for. Draft a budget. Draft and refine a letter of inquiry, and that can be an ongoing process. Research grant makers that might qualify. And then for writing the grant, the key steps, I would say gather your research and statistics. Get your letters of support early because they might take a while to get to you. Use your letter of inquiry to help get them. Identify your goals and objectives. Identify a project timeline. Draft your statement of need. Draft your project narrative. Draft your introduction. And then finally your cover letter. So it might seem backwards, but that's the way to make it most succinct. So that's the end of my presentation. You can certainly contact me at the email address you see on your screen. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So is there a time where grant writing doesn't make sense and the organization should focus somewhere else, like corporate giving, lack of resources? What type?
Yeah, I can read that again. I absolutely do think that there is a time when you might be in a stronger position to pursue grant funding, especially if those questions that I posed at the end of the presentation give you any red flags in terms of your ability to commit to writing good, strong grant applications. I think a lot of nonprofit organizations, when they're not in a position to write effective applications, it wastes a lot of time. If you feel like you're in a stronger position to pursue corporate funding, go for that right now and put grant writing as part of a long-term strategy that you want to work towards. I think people often think grant writing is something that you can just kind of do on the side, and it really needs to be a more focused and strategic approach to fundraising. So I absolutely do think there are times and situations in nonprofits where it's not the right moment to pursue it, but I do encourage you to make it part of your strategy to pursue in the long term.